So there are two tendencies you want to avoid here. On the one hand, you want to avoid the worldly, the naturalistic temptation to say, well, there is no life after death. After you die, that's it. You're just like, any other beast or animal, butterfly. That's it. That's the end of the story. We want to avoid that for the obvious reasons that also is illogical, and philosophers can explain why there's good reason to think that there's life after death, the soul, that there's an aspect of the human person that lives beyond death. We also want to avoid the other pitfall, and that is the pitfall of saying, yeah, well, as soon as you die, you're canonized. You're a saint, right? Everybody, the moment they die, becomes Saint so-and-so, right? Everyone goes to heaven. All dogs go to heaven. So we want to avoid these two pitfalls. On the one hand, a kind of worldly skepticism that dismisses the possibility of life after death. We also want to avoid the danger of canonizing people immediately after their death and just assuming that all people directly go to heavenly bliss. Why is that? Well, in the scriptures, we recognize that there is a need for us to be not just saved from the fires of damnation, but for us to become like Christ. It's a little funny for me to spend a lot of time talking about heaven and hell and life after death, because in my context, most people I know have thought of Catholic teaching, have thought of their spiritual life in reductivistic terms that puts off salvation as a future event, right? For in my context, lots of people don't even talk about being saved. They just talk about going to heaven, right? And you see this in Catholic circles a lot, that we don't actually use that language of being saved. Maybe there's a concern that we're going to sound too much like non-Catholic Christians who use that language. But I'm often worried about being preoccupied with death, because the New Testament shows us that salvation isn't simply about a future reality where you go to a heavenly homeland. That's only part of it. The New Testament insists that salvation very much has to do with the here and now.
We don't know what's absolutely, with certainty, what is beyond death. But the only lens that we could ever look through is the lens of faith through the person of Jesus Christ, the firstborn of the dead. Seeing Jesus Christ risen triumphant from the grave and witnessing what happens to his humanity and his body, even after that resurrection, before he ascends into heaven, gives us a little bit of a focus to see dimly, almost in the form of reflection, like St. Paul says in the New Testament. We see dimly in this age. Well, Jesus' resurrection gives us that ability to see dimly into the mystery of death and what comes after death in the resurrection. And clearly, in the ascension of Jesus, we have really the body now entering into a state that is in bliss. Jesus drawn up into the heavens. So when we consider death and how should we look at it? Well, as faithful followers of Christ, we should look at death through the lens of faith and believe that God who is love, that Deus caritas est, that God who is love has a plan for us through death to fulfill our deepest affections and our longings.